welcome you to this last session, and this is going to be in cooperation with Al Jazeera Mubashir, convened by Al Jazeera Center for Studies. So, the session of today, the fifth session, which is under the title Structural Repercussions, the Recalibration of the Balance of Power. So we're going to talk about the spillover that might happen if the situation aggravates and what can be the results and the changes that might happen if either Russia or the weak becomes the weaker link, and this would give the opportunity to the other forces to expand. We would like to welcome you, Dr. Wong. You're being introduced by the presenter. Good to have you with us in this segment. From from the New Delhi, we have Mr. Brahman. You're being introduced with your full title. And from Virginia, ma'am, you're being introduced with your full name and your full title. This applies to all our three guests. We can see you in vision. You've been introduced. We have also from Cairo, Dr. Hassan Nafa, Professor of Political Studies from Cairo. I would like to welcome you all to this segment. We would like to start with Mr. Wong from Malaysia. So, the view of the different regions vis-a-vis what is happening between Russia and Ukraine, depending on their interests and their views, or what is the happening. So, what is your comment on that, sir?
Well, in Asia, we see very different opinions. On one hand, you have Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan joining the West in applying sanctions on Russia. On the other hand, you have China, who refuse to condemn Russia for invading Ukraine. And we further have India, Israel, and UAE uh, that prefer to side with Russia passively, quietly, despite being the West allies. And in between them, we have many countries who, while, while they join to vote for the motions in United Nations against Russia invasion, but privately they do not take it further. They see double standard, selective justice, and some even racism in the West's moral high ground in defending Ukraine. At the end of the day, what we are seeing here is a questions that facing a set of international order that is compromised by Western bias and double standard. Should we support this international order when it works? Or should we take a cynical attitude towards it? Specifically, the Russian invasions of Ukraine raised four important questions. The first, is there any limit to this narrative of national insecurity or sphere of influence? In the sense that big countries, do they have the right to decide how their neighbors, their smaller neighbors, should behave and send in the troops if the neighbors do not do as they wish? Just last weekend, we have commentators in Australia calling for the Australian government to invade Solomon Islands in South Pacific because the South Pacific island state is going to sign a deal with China, and they fear that China would set up military base just at the doorstep of Australia. Now that's the same argument that Putin used in invading Ukraine, arguing that the eastward expansions of NATO is threatening national securities of Russia. So if we were to adopt the same standard, we would have to support, if we support Putin's argument, then we have to support Australia, the call for Australia to invade Solomon Island. The second question, Should countries be allowed to unilaterally change international border by force? The idea of irredentism is not new, but after the end of Cold War, this invasion is a second full-scale war over territorial ambitions. The first one, as many of our friends here would know, was the 1990 Iraqi invasions of Kuwait. The third question we need to ask is indiscriminate killing of civilians an acceptable means to subdue the enemy. This again is nothing new. In the 13th centuries, that's how the Mongolians conquered much of Eurasia. They ran down from Samarkand to Baghdad to Eastern Europe with a surrender or die terror tactic on their targets. And we know well that Russia bombed cities into ruins. First, Grozny of Chechen in the 90s, and then Aleppo of Syria in 2016 to force its enemy to surrender. Should this be the new norm? The final question is a threat of tactical nuclear weapon acceptable as a bargaining chip in conventional warfare, meaning that if we cannot win, if a country cannot win a conventional war, does it has a right to threaten to use tactical nuclear power? Because this is what Russia has been doing, hinting that the potentialities of using its tactical nuclear weapon. And should that be acceptable? So we are facing four important questions, pertinent questions, that if the answers are all yes, then the world would be more dangerous than now. So we really face a choice of whether to accept and to defend or to preserve an imperfect compromise international order and to stop the war in Ukraine by forcing Russia to back down, or out of our revulsions of the bias of Western bias and double standard, we opt for a free for all new era. So that's I see as the choice that Asian countries need to make. Thank you. Shukran.
So the presenter is summarizing the main points that you have mentioned there, talking about double standardness and also showing some bias. So here would like to move now to Dr. Brahma. So the question is coming to you. So the behavior of India is similar to the behavior of China in terms of response. So, how the interests of the two countries have become similar? Is it in the interest of India that the West exits this war weak? And this is going, of course, to make China very strong. How do you see that, sir?
That's an interesting question. The fact is that India is pursuing an independent foreign policy, and under successive Indian governments, India has pursued an independent foreign policy. So there's nothing new in terms of India's approach. India, as you know, was a founding leader of the non-aligned movement. It is still one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement. And during the Cold War, India adopted a position of neutrality. India is again neutral in the present conflict. This conflict pits Russia against the NATO alliance led by the United States. And if you look at the larger world, the sanctions on Russia have been imposed only by the West. The rest of the world, making up about 80% of the world's population, has imposed no sanctions on Russia. Also, if you look at the number of countries that have condemned Russia's invasion, 141 countries condemned Russia's aggression in the UN General Assembly. But the one-fourth of the countries that did not support that resolution make up more than half of humanity. So that tells you a lot about the split in the global community. There is no single position on this conflict. A large number of countries have taken neutral or nuanced position, and India is just one of them. It so happens that for a change, India and China are largely on the same side, though there are important differences between the Chinese position and the Indian position. But broadly speaking, both for a change are on the same side. So you were right in that sense. But there are some broader implications that we have to keep in mind because in this session we're talking about the long term structural ramifications of the conflict. And those long term structural ramifications are going to be profound. After all, the sanctions for the West against Russia are the broadest sanctions in history. They're affecting India, they're affecting Qatar, they're affecting much of the world. So wherever we live, we are affected by the present conflict. We are affected by the conflict. We are also affected by the disruption in the supply chains, and the impact of the Western sanctions is also global in its reach. So this is really a watershed moment in international relations whose ramifications are profound, and the structural implications are going to transform international geopolitics and also transform the global economy. Potentially, we might see the global economy splitting, bifurcating into two blocks. If that were to happen, it would be the reverse of the globalization trend.
So the presenter is summarizing your intervention, talking about the neutrality of the position. So, Madame, this is your turn now. So the question is coming to you. You're being introduced once again by the presenter. So the invasion of Russia has shown that there are communities within Ukraine that do not want to lose their identity by being fused into Russia. What is your comment, ma'am?
Thank you. It's a very important question, and it's actually draw on a bigger frame which I want to start with. Usually, when we speak about war in between Russia and Ukraine right now, people speak about Cold War, returning to Cold War. We have to understand that this completely different relationship, which was during Cold War. Cold War, we had communism, socialism versus Western country. Now it's completely different. We see authoritarianism, versus Western liberal positioning. And Ukraine for a long time, unfortunately, even in Western scholarship, was presented as a very divide based on language and ethnicity, with some areas controlled by Russia through media, through policies, and very loyal to Russia, and a lot of Russian speaking population, which basically around 40-50%, depending on different polls, were considered somebody who is loyal to Russia. And this is one of the reasons why actually Putin also believes that population in Ukraine will be extremely happy, especially in the south and in the east, that he will bring his power and impose more Russian influence. But if we look deeper into the position of Ukraine, into the history of Orange Revolution, history of Maidan, people died defending liberal position of Ukraine. So Ukraine should not be, the Ukraine-Russian opposition should not be considered in the terms of ethnicity, Ukraine versus Russia. I would really suggest our listeners to think about it more like authoritarian nationalistic position of Russia and more pro-liberal position of Ukraine that Ukraine chose from multiple events. So then Putin invaded Russia expecting that a lot of people in the East will be supportive of his advancing, and people, for example, in Kharkiv, was mostly Russian speaking. I talk a lot. I had project in Kharkiv and Mariupol and Kherson recently. Then this particular group of population will be very welcoming. In reality, for them, seeing civilian devastation, seeing civilians killed, complete disrespect for the life of people from Russia, this a very aggressive invasion in a territory of independent country only put people together. We see growing Ukrainian national identity like we never saw before. I was told by my colleagues from Kharkiv, which is eastern Ukraine, that now how they define themselves. We are not Russian-speaking population. We people who speak and know, not speak, but we people who know language of the enemy. So what Putin actually achieved completely opposite what he hoped. It's now we see strong unification of Ukraine, and we also see this growing pro-liberal orientation within Ukrainian group, Ukrainian population.
So, your intervention is being summarized, talking about what Putin was expected. So, he was expecting something, and what he expected did not happen. So, and people were able to unify themselves. People speak Russian, but they know Russian, but not necessarily this is their language. So we're going to move now to Dr. Hassan Nafa, our guest with us here today. So please stay with us. The Arab states are very much different in their positions vis-à-vis any cause. So the differences in terms of the different governments and the positions of the Arab governments is not something that is strange or weird. And we're going to see that a country such as the Emirates, which is a country that represents the Arab countries in the Security Council, abstained from voting and did not want to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I do not think that they have consulted with the Arab countries when it comes to finding a joint position that would unify the ranks of Arab countries. There are some other countries that have been neutral, some others have abstained, some others did not attend, very simply. So these different positions are an expression of the fact that the Arab countries are not unified vis-à-vis many causes, including this one. So, if we look at the parameters of the different Arab positions, we will find that the interests of the Arab country vis-à-vis this state or that state, if we look at the view of these ruling regimes when it comes to their interests with Ukraine, with the US, or with Russia, that leads the international coalition against Russia, and this coalition imposes sanctions on Russia. So the view of these countries is the one that indicates the position vis-à-vis the crisis. But we have to take into account also the clear difference when it comes to the positions of the different Arab countries and the Arab peoples. So, if we would like to gauge the positions of the different peoples of the Arab world through social media, for instance, we're going to see that the position, the popular position, was understanding the position of Russia because Arab nations and the expansion that took place, and the fact that the countries of NATO have not met and honored the countries that were part of the USSR. Many of them understood the other position, but the decisive position when it comes to Arab nations is this double standards that was revealed during the Ukrainian crisis. So Arab nations know. So, when it comes also to the occupation of Israel to Palestine and also the different violations that have been committed and so on, and we find that the United States of America is partial to the occupying power. The same applies to the position vis-à-vis refugees and migrants. So, the view vis-à-vis the Ukrainians is different because they are white people with blue eyes. So this is also another racial kind of view. There was a lot of criticism that was made by many commentators on social media. So Dr. Hassan Nafa, so there was one part of the question that talked about the differences that you have indicated in terms of position vis-à-vis what is taking place. Can this lead to more polarization in the Arab world? No. I think that the reasons of polarization are many and they are relevant to matters that are important for the Arab world more than the crisis in Ukraine. In Ukraine, this is an international kind of crisis. It has to do with the balance of power, but the polarization have to do with regard to the position of vis-a-vis what is happening in Syria, vis-a-vis what is happening in Libya, or the position of political Islam and democracy, and so on and so forth. And I do not think that polarization in the Arab world is linked to what is happening in Ukraine. And consequently, the fact that we have different positions with regard to what is happening in Ukraine, in my view, is not going to lead to more polarization in the Arab world. And the situation in the Arab world is going to stay as it is now, as it used to be before the crisis.
So the factors that dictate the Arab positions were directly linked to the position of those Arab countries with Ukraine, Russia, and even the US. Dr. Shinwat Wong, now to you. China has expressed its support of Russia more than once, and it didn't condemn the invasion, while the Biden administration warned it from supporting Putin. Is China going to stay unbiased, or will this change according to how the war change, and will this further China's global position or weaken it?
China actions is fully guided by its own self-interest and would change according to its assessments of risk. In Ukraine, we are seeing actually two battlefields of stamina. One on the military front, which is Russia versus Ukraine, and on the economic front is Russia versus the West and the rest of the world that would have to endure the outcome of the sanctions. And what would China do next? We have to look at the five possible outcomes of this war. The first is Ukraine's surrender. The second is Ukraine's partition. with the eastern part either being annexed into Russia as Crimea was has been, or be made some puppet states uh, allied to Russia. The third option is the other way around, Russia's exhaustion, and may even be followed by some leadership change. The fourth outcome is escalations of the war into possibly a World War III. And the final outcome is to have ceasefire and restorations of the status quo before 24th of February with the additions of Ukraine's neutrality and with much of the sanctions lifted. Now, from China perspective, the best outcome, of course, would be Ukraine's surrender. Or next, the second best is Ukraine partition because that would humiliate and weaken the West, and also open the door for its military actions on Taiwan when it sees fit. However, the war is not going to that directions. As I say that we are having two battlefields of stamina. And in the event that Russia get exhausted first before Ukraine, that would, of course, be a disadvantage to China. But much worse is the escalation into a World War III, because China has a chance to defeat America in this peaceful competition, the rivalry tense but remain peaceful, and a World War III would destroy that opportunity. So the best option now for China would be to assess really that is it worthy to take the risk of backing Russia to go for at least a partition instead of pressing Russia to back down. Because without China's support, I do not think uh, Russia can continue with this war. With due respect to India, China is the power that can support Russia in this whole overwhelming wave of sanctions. So really come back to this, and from China's perspective, to have the, a quick ceasefire, a restorations much of the status quo before 24th of February is in its best interest. Why? Because Russia would be weakened, but not broken, and therefore would be dependent on China and become China sidekick in the Sino-American rivalry, and that would be much better than to go for the risky outcome of either World War II or a Russia defeat and leadership change. So in any case now, China is gaining from the war. What it should really think about is whether to drag it on further. When it can, it has everything to tell Putin to stop and cut his losses. Shukran.
Thank you, Dr. Shin. Thinks that the Chinese position is directly linked to its. Anyway, China, as he sees, is going to gain. Dr. Brahma Shilani, the war will end with Russia and NATO countries emerging weaker. Both countries or both camps have followers and supporters from different continents. Do you think that the world is going to witness chaos due to the imbalances due to this invasion?
Well, it's an interesting question. I believe that both NATO and Russia could emerge stronger from this conflict. In the short term, we're already seeing NATO unity, we're seeing greater consolidation of NATO. Today, Russia is the target of unprecedented sanctions, but there's going to be a nationalistic backlash in Russia. And eventually, this could lead to the emergence of a new Soviet Union. So one cannot discount that. In other words, far from both sides emerging weaker or one side emerging weaker and the other side stronger, it's possible that both sides, in the longer time frame, might come out looking stronger. But I think there are larger consequences for the world. Many had believed that economically interdependent states would rather trade than invade. But we have seen several examples from this century that economic interdependence is no constraint on the use of brute might. And to make matters worse, economic interdependence today has been weaponized by the West to punish Russia. Today, economic power has shifted to the East, but the West still controls the financial system. And the present crisis could lead to the establishment of parallel arrangements. The crisis will likely intensify the search for a viable alternative system, a system that is not open to weaponization or dominance by any bloc. So there are important implications that this crisis holds for the world. For example, we are seeing, for example, Saudi Arabia considering yuan-based oil sales to China, while India has recently, in the last week, agreed to buy Russian oil by paying in Indian rupees. So we're already seeing early signs that this crisis holds important implications. Now, the implications also in terms of balance of power, but the balance of power aspect should be looked at both from the economic perspective as well as from the geopolitical perspective. First, from the geopolitical perspective, it's very clear that this crisis will deepen the axis between Beijing and Moscow. That axis between China and Russia against the US has been driven largely by American policy, but now that axis is likely to become stronger. But more importantly, China will emerge as the big winner financially and geopolitically. That would mean greater expansion of Chinese economic and military power. If you look at the economic sanctions that the West has imposed on Moscow, those sanctions are likely to turn China into Russia's banker, enabling it to reap vast profits. In structural terms, too, Russia's sanctions pain will likely become China's gain. In fact, China's priority will be to insulate itself from similar Western sanctions if it were to invade Taiwan. Because if it were to invade Taiwan, it would face somewhat similar Western sanctions. So China's priority in the coming years will be to insulate itself from the impact of Western sanctions in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So China will seek to boost the payments and reserve role of the yuan. It will like to see the greater international use of its competitor to the SWIFT system. China has its rival to the SWIFT system, known as the cross-border interbank payment system. So the effort on the part of China will be to increase the international use of its alternative system. The EU could emerge as a as the main loser from the present crisis. The EU has long struggled to be a major international player, but now, because of this conflict, many European Union countries have decided to substantially raise their defense spending. But by increasing the defense spending, they'll be buying more American arms, they'll become more reliant on the US. And also, there is the bigger danger that the flood of Western arms to Ukraine could eventually flow back westwards into Europe and undermine Europe's internal security. So the EU, the European Union, is in danger of coming out as a loser from the present crisis. There are also implications for the Indo Pacific region, which is the largest region in the world. Three successive American presidents, Barack Obama, then Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden, have promised to make the Indo Pacific region the primary strategic focus of American policy. But Obama failed to generally pivot to Asia. Donald Trump tried, but he couldn't really pivot to Asia or Indo Pacific. And now Biden is making the same promise. In fact, just last month, Biden unveiled his Indo Pacific strategy. But I think this conflict in Ukraine will overstretch America. And overstretched America will remain preoccupied with European security. And that will leave the US little strategic space to genuinely pivot to the Indo Pacific. All this has important implications for Asian security, especially for Taiwan security, but also for the security of the Middle East. I think
Yes, sir.
greater turmoil in
She's
Asia and the Middle
interrupting you.
East.
Sorry. She's saying that she's summarizing what you said. She's talking about the polarism. China will come out winning, and the EU is the biggest loser. Miss Karina. So, humanitarian considerations are taken or focused on, and how are both Russia and Ukraine using the humanitarian considerations as part of their strategic and political strategy? And why are they disagreeing on the destination of refugees? Russia wants them to come to it, while Ukraine wants them to go to its European allies.
This is a very important question. Thank you very much. And first, I really want to address the reasons for humanitarian crisis. In addition to usual situation when non-combatant civilians become collateral damage, they are dehumanized and they perceived as non-important results of military intervention, we see specially crafted rule of engagement with target civilian population in Ukraine. And this specific targeting have several goals. First, to intimidate Ukrainian government and to push them to agree to all Russian demands regarding the peace negotiation. Second, that actually to reduce the ability of Ukrainian people to be a force which try to prevent military intervention, and try to intimidate and reduce resistance of Ukrainian people. But what we see in reality, it actually didn't work. The civilian devastation, this targeted killing of civilians in Kharkiv, in Mariupol, which Mariupol now become mostly destroyed with carpet bombing. We see that it's actually united Ukrainian population, but the most important that it's not really symmetric. It's not both Russia and Ukraine trying to use humanitarian crisis to their purposes. It's clearly that Russia does. It's clearly for Putin is important to show that people in the south and the east of Ukraine are interested to go to Russia. They have loyalty to Russia, and they would love to have Russia as legitimate government in this area. So now today, then he agreed to limit or decrease the the military action in Kiev, around Kiev and the north, and now he's concentrating the whole military Russian concentrating now in the east and the south to expand from Donetsk and Lugansk. We see that they're trying to use these corridors to Moscow and towards the Moscow, towards the Russian territories as legitimization for Western governments to show, you see, Russian people want in Ukraine want to be under the Russian, while Ukrainian government and together with Western different Western volunteer organizations, international organizations, actually open corridors for people to escape. Some of them just escape to different cities in Ukraine. Some of them trying to be refugees in Europe, if possible for them. But you are completely right. There is a game on the Russian part to increase this legitimacy. But this question, very quickly, I want to stress this, also raise the entire issue of humanitarian crisis and the peace architecture. Then in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. Unfortunately, world was just watching with very limited sanctions. And then in 2014, we saw that entire world hold Olympic Games in Sochi, which were several kilometers from occupied territories of Abkhazia and Ossetia. It was January 2014. And few weeks after this Olympic Games, the entire world basically accepted occupation of Abkhazia and Ossetia. Russia occupied and then annexed Crimea, then came into Donetsk and Lugansk. And this have to be a very important lesson for the world, how we prevent, how we use United Nations, the article of United Nations peacekeeping, how we use preventive sanctions, how we use the whole laws which are developed by international organizations to actually prevent humanitarian catastrophe that could be preventative. So I think it's a really raising question, not only for peace security, but for peace architecture in the entire world. And countries now really have to come together and see how international organizations have to be more effective in early warning as the most important and preventive of such conflicts. Thank you.
Dr. Hassan Nafa, now to you. President Putin and tyrannical Russia was an example for a number of Arab countries. How will Putin and his invasion and his potential success going to affect the Arab countries? Let's look at the first part of this question. The hegemonial regimes in the Arab world were present before the crisis in Ukraine and will remain after that, whether Putin succeeds or fails. But maybe Putin's success, one way or another, may lead to the emergence of a new world order, a multilateral world, and not a unilateral world. It may seem at first glance that this may lead to the regression of the U.S. role. Sorry, the more pressure, sorry, by the U.S. on the hegemonial countries. However, when the U.S. was solely leading the world order, and the U.S. is a democratic country, the democracy didn't benefit much in the Arab world from this U.S. hegemony. The United States, unfortunately, did not do much to save the revolutions of the Arab Spring that started in order to look for democratic regimes and brought down some of the tyrannical and hegemonial leaders. So I think that those tyrannical and despot regimes in the Arab world are intrinsically present, and that's why I think that the crisis in Ukraine is going to directly affect democracy in the Arab world. Now, to answer the other part of the question, is the regime in Ukraine truly democratic? I think that even international organizations do not categorize it as democratic. They consider it to be as an incompletely democratic regime in Ukraine, so it's not fully democratic. Whether it were democratic or not, when any country is invaded, usually people unite regardless of the nature of the regime they're in. So we remember when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Stalin was governing Russia, and the hegemonial nature of this regime was very clear. Despite that, the people in the Soviet Union rallied around this tyrannical regime. They resisted and they paid heavy the price with the sacrifices, and they overcame and they defeated the German regime, which had come to Germany in 1933 in a very democratic manner. Hitler was elected actually by the majority of voters in Germany. So I don't think that a big and strong resistance in Ukraine, as we see, has to do with whether the Ukrainian regime is democratic or not. I highly doubt this resistance. There is a Ukrainian patriotic current or movement that is highly anti-Russian. So I think that the resistance is rallying around this movement. This is the one that constitutes the center or the heart of resistance in Ukraine. It's not about the fact that the democratic regime in Ukraine that has led to the rooting of this resistance or not. I would like to go back to Mr. Shinwat Wong, professor of sustainable development in Malaysia. Some observers believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine revealed that there are conflicting axes, the Western Atlantic axis led by the US, and on the other hand, the Russian-Chinese axis and some of the emerging regional forces. Are these true axes? Or have we entered the end of the Western leadership, or did this anchor and even further promoted the Western leadership of the world?
Thank you, Ms. Moderator. Unless that the Ukrainian war led us into a World War II or Russia exhaustions, leading to a regime change. Otherwise, we are seeing the emergence of a new Cold War. Uh, and hopefully, this new Cold War would be not worse than the old one. And I hope that there will be some ground rule. The first is there would be no unilateral change of international border by military means. Second, that no power would threaten to use tactical nuclear weapon as in conventional warfare. And if possible, then we should look for, if this new Cold War is inevitable, then we should look for a better outcome that hopefully it would be about competition between the two camps on systemic competence in delivering development and human well-being. It would be a competition of technological advancement. It would be a competition on in global leadership. to overcome climate change, to spread out development to the rest of the world, and finally, a competition to woo poor countries, smaller countries, with benefits rather than threatening them with missiles. To have this situation, uh, and this is inevitable because that after the unprecedented waves of sanctions, both China and Western businesses would want to push for decoupling. And we will be seeing a situation where a weakened Russia would become a sidekick of China, as how a weakened Belarus has now become a sidekick of Russia. And Xi Jinping would be China's most powerful ruler since Kublai Khan, because he, without using any troops, his influence would stretch from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. And this would not be a good picture for the West, but it's certainly better than having Putin threatening to press the nuclear button anytime that he's not happy. The West need to look into two main problems. The first is the internal division. Never in American history you have a former president like Trump that would cheer for military adventurism of its arch rival, Russia or Soviet Union in the past. That points to the deep division in Western society signaled by the rise of ultra right and sometimes ultra left. The second problem is the West double standard. There is a price to pay when the West simply ignore the bias and expect everyone to follow. We learned that many Arabs support Russia, even though Russians has bombed Aleppo of Syria into ruins, killing thousands of civilians. Why would Arabs support Russia? That's because that they get so fed up with American double standard. So for America, for the West to prevail in the new Cold War, it must fix its internal division and its external double standard hypocrisy.
Yes, so once again, there's a focus on the double standards and dealing with this crisis. I ask Mr. or Dr. Brahma Sheilani, you're being introduced again. So, the Russian invasion of Ukraine revealed that the UN agencies failed again in preventing a member of Security Council from violating the international law. How will this affect the country's behavior in protecting its security? And will we see a new race towards armament in new countries? And with Russia threatening to use the nuclear weapons, will it increase the number of countries that are seeking to gain this weapon to protect themselves?
That's a very important question. If you look back at history, the League of Nations, which was formed after World War I, the League of Nations failed because it could not deter or punish important powers from flouting international law. Its successor, the United Nations, already confronts increasing marginalization in world affairs. If you see it in this current Ukraine conflict, what's the role of the UN? The UN is on the margins. It's not really playing a role. To make matters worse, the UN Security Council faces a gridlock. The gridlock in the UN Security Council will become worse as a consequence of the confrontation between the Western powers and the Sino Russian axis. The UN Charter gives the mandate to the Security Council to uphold international peace and security. But today, the Security Council of the UN is split between two rival alliances, the Western alliance on one side and the Russian Chinese alliance on the other side. So, in this situation, how can the UN Security Council uphold international peace and security? There's also one other important aspect, which is that the world will likely remain the same in one critical aspect. The strong will continue to call the shots, leaving the weak with little choice but to stay meek. Strength respects strength in international relations, while the weak remain meek. We all talk about a rules based order, but what is the rules based order? The fact is that the rule of force has long trumped the rule of law. As a result, a rules based international order remains more of an aspiration than a reality. The plain fact is that those with the military or economic might to order others make international rules and enforce compliance with those rules. But these same rule makers also break international rules at their own sweet will. Whenever they want, they break those very rules. And an international conflict arises when the rule makers themselves disagree, when they lock horns over a particular geopolitical situation and trample on the rules. This is what we are seeing today in the conflict over Ukraine. Ukraine is just a pawn between Russia and the NATO alliance. But both sides have trampled on international rules. Both sides are pursuing unilateralism, and both sides have shown that international law really doesn't matter for the strong. So the standoff is likely to
Okay, sir.
compound challenges
Okay.
to
Sorry,
international
just
law.
interrupting you. So, Dr. Brahma, this part of this question is more than enough, but there was also a part of the question if we are going to witness a new wave of armament, the race to armament, only in 1 minute, sir. Go ahead.
Well, I think we're going to see two things. One, because the European Union major states have already decided to raise their defense spending substantially. So we're going to see a new arms race, and the arms race will also be two sided. Russia will also rearm, China will also boost its military spending. So we will see a new arms race. We will also see a growing attraction for nuclear weapons. It's very clear from the present crisis that if you have nuclear weapons, they provide you security against a direct attack. For example, the West will not take on Russia directly. They are only pursuing a proxy war against Russia because Russia is such a big nuclear power. So nuclear weapons are going to become increasingly attractive too.
So we may witness a race towards this armament. Ms. Karina Karostellina are being introduced again. So, previous wars have launched waves of refugees to Europe and the West in general, and the populist movements have been fed based on xenophobia. Do you think that this crisis is going to increase further populism in Europe or rather weaken it?
Thank you for this question. If I may, just a quick note, I really want to support previous speaker with and stress the importance of Europe, of United Nations and other organizations, which unfortunately did not show their efficacy, and the complete inability of UN Security Council to address this issue. In the same time, we see how Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and other countries which now perceive as a borderline, as a wide east of democracy, some which do not have an agency, do not have a voice. They consider it, as I was heard, like a pound between two states, between two systems, instead of empowering them and giving them ability to make their own choice. But returning to your question, which is very important, if we take parallel what happened in Ukraine after the Russian invasion Donetsk and Lugansk, we saw a huge amount of IDPs, several million people. And in the beginning, there were a lot of support for them. They were easily integrated into other communities in Ukraine. There were very, very supportive communities hosting them, providing resources. But unfortunately, with time, maybe in a year or two, this hosting community starts seeing a lot of pressure and some negative reactions start occurring there with prejudice. We might expect the same in Europe. And again, it will depend on the scope of refugee numbers, but also on how long longevity of this war. Now we see a lot of not just empathy, but also compassion. Compassion really is it's a ability of people to provide help and willingness to provide help. In comparison with other conflicts, we see that there are no refugee camps, and every single Ukrainian is adopted to the family, accepted. A lot of my friends and I really want to express a lot of thanks to all universities in Europe and centers which were able to accept my colleagues as for some short period or longer period. A lot of families are now sharing their houses with refugees, but the issue is how long this war will persist and how many refugees will go. There are some capacities of communities, unfortunately, to accept newcomers, and we might see some backlash. We might see also rise of populism, especially if people will be not able to return within a longer period, at least a year. And in the same time, we will see that language issue related to how fast the refugee will learn language, how fast they will be able to integrate within the school system or medical system, how much pressure it will put on social services and hosting communities will result in pressure. So resilience of hosting communities in this case is the key as an answer for your question.
Dr. Hassan Nafa, the United States and Western countries called the Arab countries to help with this crisis, but a lot of Arab countries refuse to do that. In 2 minutes, tell us about how this would reflect on the future of the dealings with the Arab countries. As we had mentioned before, this is an issue that raises a lot of thinking. Will there be further US pressure on the Arab countries to take certain positions? We have to ask ourselves first, what are those positions that are needed by the US from the Arab countries? If we look, for example, at the Arab representative of the Security Council, the UAE, I don't think that they're going to be very influential on how the crisis will evolve, because any project in the Security Council will be met with the Soviet, I think he means Russian veto and the Chinese veto, and therefore it will be thwarted. The impact that the Arab countries have on the UNGA General Assembly is not too much. 141 countries voted in favor of the Western position that condemns the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the General Assembly, and this did not affect the way that this crisis goes. What can affected one way or another is the issue of oil and the possibility that the United States may need to exert more pressure on some Arab countries that are abiding by the OPEC Plus agreement, or if there is a need to continue. Of course, this is going to depend on how long the duration of the crisis. Will it last long? And will the sanctions imposed on Russia have a real effect? And will the issue of oil play a decisive role here? In this case, the United States may exert further pressure. However, if we compare the positions of the Arab countries, and if we try to reflect on the nature of the pressure that can be exerted by the United States on some Arab countries, we find that the United States failed in exerting pressure on its closest allies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Therefore, I do not think that the United States is going to have the ability to exert a bigger impact than the pressure. Anyway, the Arab position is not going to affect a lot how this crisis goes. Now we will go to social media and we will listen to the comments of some of our writers, and then we will hear from our guests those comments. So Muhammad thinks that Putin has lost the battle because he invaded another country. The Russians realize now that the US dragged them to the Ukrainian quagmire to undermine their economy. There is no great army. Even the US and its military might lost in Vietnam, and the same happened to the Soviet Union with Afghanistan before. Masoud Bashir says Russia destroyed airports, stations, and controlled harbors and marine points of entry and exit. So it's not benefiting from losing its equipment and soldiers. Khalid Raut says that Kiev will fall soon because Russia will provide the people a chance to get the supplies needed to stay and their hidings and their shelters. Muhammad thinks that there is no third world war. Russia is going to annex Ukraine, some sanctions, some condemnations that are of no use. Just mere talk, we condemn, we demand to stop the invasion, etc. Such saying was something that Putin prepared for very well after his strong alliance with China. So we have reached the end of the session. She's going to reintroduce you and she's going to end this interview. We thank our guests via Skype from Kuala Lumpur, Dr. Shinhua Tuang. You are being introduced. From New Delhi, Dr. Brahma Shilani. You are being introduced again and thanked for your input. From virtually.
Thank you.
Ms. Karina, you are also being introduced and thanked for your input. Thank you, ma'am. And Dr. Hassan Nafa from Cairo, speaking in Arabic. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for translating. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miss Translator.